Welcome back to VBA Made Easy. In the last couple of episodes, we covered setting up your Visual Basic for Applications programming environment, writing your first function, writing your first sub, and then some various methods of calling or running that sub that you just wrote. Today, we're going to get a little more advanced. We're going to talk about integrating Excel and PowerPoint, integrating Excel in the web, in this case, downloading an image from the web and inserting it into the PowerPoint slide. We're going to talk about the Windows Application Programming Interface, or API call, that we use to download that image from the web. We're going to talk about collections and class modules. Let's start off by looking at the end result of the code we're trying to write. So I'm going to use VBA to add a button. Poof, there's a button, and let's run our code. So that code is going to open PowerPoint. It's going to insert a table that contains the number of rows that our data contains. And it's going to format that. It's going to download this image from the web showing the location of the airports we're talking about. And here's the departure data for those airports, the top 10 airports in the United States in this particular month. So how did we get here? First thing I want to do, let's go to the Developer tab. If the Developer tab is not showing on your ribbon, you can watch this video here, and that'll explain how to get the Developer tab added to your ribbon. So the first thing I want to do is talk about class modules. What is a class module? Think of a class module as a container to hold stuff. In this case, it's holding the 7 data elements that we need for our slide, but it can also hold things like subs or functions that you can call from elsewhere in your code. Today, we're going to use the class module to populate a collection of classes that contains the data that we're putting on our slide, and then pass that information, once it's collated, pass it to the PowerPoint slide. All right, before we jump into the code, I want to talk about breakpoints. Breakpoints are those burgundy lines that you see there. What that's going to do is, if you run the code, it's going to run to that point and then stop. And then from that point, you can either hit the play button or F5, or you can hit F8 to step down to the next line, so you can step through your code a lot easier. To add a breakpoint, you can go to the debug window and use toggle breakpoint, or you can use F9. If you try and add a breakpoint at a location that the program won't allow, you'll get an error message that says breakpoint not allowed on this line. So to start off, I've defined my PowerPoint integration. So I've defined obj PPT, or object PowerPoint, as an object, and I've defined a shape that's going to be our table to hold our data, and that is defined as a PowerPoint.shape. I've also defined a collection. So what is a collection? Collection is similar to an array in that it holds information. The difference is a collection will only hold unique items. So if you try to loop through a row of data and add that data to a collection, it will stop or error out if it finds a duplicate to something that's already in the collection. Where an array, you can just add as many duplicates as you need. And we've defined a class. So we've defined the CLS as class flights, but we haven't instanced the class. So it knows that if I talk about CLS, it's a class, but I haven't created an instance of that class. Next, I've got several variants that I use to loop through my data, including one to define the minimum width for each table column. And then I've got 2 strings, map URL and map URL temp, that we're going to use to get that map of the different airports. So let's go ahead and run this code, and it's going to run until it gets to that first breakpoint and then stop. So the first thing it's going to do is make sure we're on the right sheet. So sheets, airport data top 10, select. If I go back to my Excel sheet, you see we're now on the sheet with the data. Next, I'm going to loop through the data, and I've defined the range to start at A2. That's the first cell that's got data in column A. And then I'm using range A65536 and Excel up to find the last row in column A that has data in it. So it's going to go down to A65536. It's going to come up until it finds data finding the last row with data. So if I hit F8, it's going to go to the next line. So I am now instancing that class. So set CLS equals new class flight. So now that I've instanced that class, I can assign data to each of those class members by typing CLS dot. I see all the members of that class, and the first thing I want is the ICAO because that's column 1 equals I value. And I did the same thing with each of the other data points. CLS airport equals I offset 0 rows and 1 column. Flight cancel is 2 columns over. Late is 3 columns, and so on. Next, I'm going to add that class to my collection. So now I've populated the class, and now I'm adding the class to the collection, and then I'm going on to the next row. So now I'm populating a new instance of that class, so it won't overwrite the existing information, and I can loop through each of those, populate that new class, and then add that class to the collection. So if I were to go down here for each CLS in COL, debug, print, CLS airport next. So once I finish this, I'm going to add a breakpoint here, and I'm going to hit F5 to run through the rest of that. If I run this, it's going to take and debug print or shoot the airport name down into the immediate window. There's all my airports. So I defined my OBJ PPT as an object, and now I'm going to use the create object function to create a PowerPoint application, and I'm going to make it visible. So now I've got PowerPoint open. Nothing's open in PowerPoint, but it's there. And I'm going to use the presentation open method to open the presentation that's located in the active workbook path. And there's the file name. And I'm going to select the second slide. So I've got 2 blank slides here, and we're selecting the second one. Now I'm going to find the last row and the last column in my data. So the last row, I go down to A65536 and come up, and that's my last row with data. And the last column, I'm going over to column XFD row 1 and coming left to find the last column with data. And now I'm going to set that PowerPoint shape that we defined earlier as a table. So I'm using active presentation slides to shapes, add table, and I want my table to be 11 rows, or the total number of rows of data that I have, and my columns to be 6, and then the initial size of my size and position of my table. So if I hit F8 now, it added that table, it named that table, and it selected that table. So if I go over to PowerPoint, see a table, I've got 11 rows and 6 columns, and that has been selected. So from this point on, we're using selection, looking at PowerPoint, active window, selection, shape range, table, cells, row 1, column 1, shape, text frame, text range, text, equals airport. So these lines here are just going to fill in the header information and place it in the cells, first row, and the first 6 columns. These green lines that you see here, I had originally hard-coded the column width of each of those columns by placing an apostrophe at the beginning of that line. It turns it into a comment, turns it green, and that code won't run. So let's hit F5, and it's going to run down to the next breakpoint. So I'm setting my R value as 2. That's going to hold the row number that I'm using as I go through the table. And now I'm going to loop through each class in the collection. I'm going to take table cell R for row 1, shape, text frame, text range, text equals the value that's in CLS airport. And as I go through this, I'm going to, for the next 5 columns, I'm making that text equal to the numbers that are in those flight cancel, flight late. I'm using the format command to add a comma separator for anything over 1,000 and format the on-time percentage as a single decimal percentage. The next thing I'm doing is using C for column, and I'm going 1 to 6 because I've got 6 columns, and I'm going to do some stuff on those columns. So the next thing I'm doing is I'm setting the border color of each cell, and I'm doing the top, bottom, left, and right, and setting that to black using the RGB 0, 0, 0. That'll set the border. So if I go here, you can see I've got my data in there, and my first cell has got the borders colored. Next, I'm going to use a calculation. If my on-time percent is less than 0.8, then I'm going to set the interior or forecolor of that table cell to be yellow using the RGB values of that. And if I'm not in the first column, so if C or column is greater than 1, I want to make the alignment right. So I'm going to take all of the numbers and have them align over to the right. And the last thing I'm going to do in this loop is I'm going to set my map URL temp equal to whatever is already in the map URL temp and the value in the class ICAO field followed by a comma. Next, I'm going to instance my row up by 1, and I'm going to go back through and do that again. So it's going to go through each class in the collection, populate the data in the table, set the borders, color it yellow if it's less than 80%, and align the text. So now I've completed that loop, and I'm going to look at what's in my map URL temp by debugging that. So I have all of the ICAO codes for those airports with a comma, and I want to concatenate the two different strings. So I've got the first part of my URL that I need for making the map, and I'm going to get the left characters of that map URL temp, and the number that I'm using for the left function is the length of the map URL temp minus 1. So that's going to get everything except for that last comma. Once I've concatenated those two, now I'm going to add the ending portion of the URL that I need, and that is the URL that I need to get my map image. The next thing I'm going to do is get rid of any existing map file that I have in my active workbook path, and I've named that file map.gif. I'm going to go out and use that map URL to call the sub import picture from web. So let's step into that. So my import picture from web sub takes an optional source file, which in this case is the URL, and an optional destination file. And then if the length of the source file is greater than 0, then use the source file as my source URL. If it's not, I've got a default set in here. If the length of my destination file is greater than 0, then use that destination file. If it's not, then use active workbook path map.gif. So I didn't pass anything to the destination file. I just passed the source file. Put a breakpoint there. So that is going to populate the fields that I need. And now it's going to use that data, which is my URL and my source file destination, to call the function download file. So download file uses an API declared URL download to file. This API call uses 0 end. That causes it to download the locally cached file if it's available, and then this is going to return an error success. So as I go here, boom, download file, end function, and that's all there is to that. So I'll put a link in the description to a place that you can download these files so that you can play with this as we're going through. Next, I'm assigning a URL that I'm going to use to insert that slide into my PowerPoint. So map URL equals active workbook path and map GIF. And now I'm going to use the shapes add picture. I'm going to add my map URL. I don't want to link to the file. I want it to actually install. I want it to save with the document, and then I can position the left and top and the width and the height to make it the size that I want. So if I go back to the first slide, there's my image that we just downloaded from the web, inserted into the PowerPoint. You notice on the table that the text wrap function is not changed, and so the rows are too high. So I'm going to loop through the columns and rows in the table. The first thing I'm going to do is set that first column to 1440, which is way wider than it needs to be. And then I'm going to loop through and find what the minimum width is by looping through each of the cells, the row cells in that first column, finding my entire width, and I'm assigning the minimum width as I go through to the min width variant. And now I'm going to set a column width equal to that minimum width that we came up with, and then I'm going to reset min width back to 0. So if I go back here, all of these are still too wide, but now the airport column is as wide as it needs to be to hold all of the data. So I'm going to let that go ahead and run. So now all of the columns have the correct width, but the table is sticking off to the side. So the next thing I'm going to do is take that shape and align it to the center. And now my table is lined up in the center. So now we're done building the slide, and I want this code to run or show the PowerPoint. So if I hit F5, I'm now in display mode, and there's my 2 slides. Next thing I want to do, I want to save that with a different file name. I could have done this at any point. I just chose to do it at the end. So now once you are done stepping through your code, it's important that you get rid of the breakpoints. If you save the Excel file with those breakpoints installed, the next time you run the code, the breakpoints won't be visible, but the code will still stop at that point. So what you want to do to get rid of all of the breakpoints is you're going to do the Shift Control F9 to clear all breakpoints. And if you forget Shift Control F9, it's on the debug window there. So one of the things, if I'm going through a large piece of code and I don't have any breakpoints currently in the module that I'm setting on, I will just go add a breakpoint and then Shift Control F9, and that gets rid of all the breakpoints throughout all the modules. So that is building a slide from Excel data into PowerPoint. Thank you for watching. If you've learned something, I'd appreciate a thumbs up, and if you feel like I've earned it, a subscription would help. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.